Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We're going to get started shortly. Please hang tight for a couple minutes. Thank you.
Jay, I'm going to hide your camera for now. This is Edward. Hi, TL. I'm going to hide your camera as well. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I want to welcome you to this 90-minute webinar. It's part of a series JDI is doing looking at especially vulnerable and underserved incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse. The focus of today's webinar is incarcerated survivors who are deaf or hard of hearing, with a goal of increasing victims' advocates' knowledge, skills, and abilities to serve these survivors in a culturally competent and sensitive way. My name is Edward Cervantes, and I am a program officer in JDI's LA office. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar is made possible by a grant from the Office on Violence Against Women. Just Detention International is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. JDI carries out its mission by working with corrections officials, rape crisis advocates, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe, promoting public attitudes that value the dignity and safety of people in detention, and supporting incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. The core principle of JDI's work is that no matter what crime a person may have committed, rape is not part of the penalty. Before we begin, I want to go over some webinar logistics. We have time at the end to answer questions, but please feel free to submit them throughout the webinar. You can submit questions in the comment box. The webinar will be recorded, and a recording will be posted on the JDI website in the coming weeks, along with a discussion guide with resources. I'd also like to add that Scott Huffman of the CC Group is joining today's webinar to provide American Sign Language English interpretation. We're still waiting for him to come on, but he should be joining us in a couple of minutes. We will also have live captioning, which can be viewed at the web address that you see on the bottom of this slide. We should say that the interpretation of this presentation is live and unrehearsed. Discrepancies between voice-to-sign and sign-to-voice translation are due to the dynamic nature of the interpreting process. This is JDI's first webinar with live captioning and ASL interpretation, so please bear with us today. If there are any moments where things don't run smoothly, we're still trying to figure this out. We will have 2 guests today, and we will provide you with additional instructions as they join us. Today's training will include stories about sexual violence, including stories from survivors. Please practice self-care during this presentation. And now I will turn things over to my colleague, Cynthia.
Okay, I think
This is Tia.
yeah, that's what I was about to say. I think we should pause and wait until the interpreter has the ASL interpreter has joined us.
Yeah, Cynthia, can you resend the link to Scott Huffman? I'm actually texting with Scott Huffman right now, and he's struggling to find the link. So if you all can just resend that link, that would be great.
Sure, I'll just take care of that right now.
Everyone, please bear with us. There was a misunderstanding, and the interpreter will be joining us shortly.
This is TL. Can someone make my picture seen so I can communicate with Esperanza and Jay?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you. And this is TL again. Edward, if you don't mind, can you just summarize what you just said so we can make sure that everyone has the full information? That would be great. Thank you. I'm going to mute myself now. You can turn my picture off.
All right. There will be time for questions at the end, but please feel free to submit them throughout the webinar. You can submit questions in the comment box that you see circled there on the screen. And also closed captioning is available at the web address that you see at the bottom of this slide. Interpretation is being provided by Scott Huffman of the CC Group. And
Great. Anything else? Oh, go ahead, Edward.
Just bear with us as we figure this out.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Okay. Great. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Cynthia Totten. I'm the Deputy Executive Director in JDI's Washington, D.C. office. I lead JDI's National Training and Technical Assistance Program supporting the work of state and tribal sexual assault coalitions, victim advocates, corrections officials, and funding administrators to ensure that incarcerated survivors have access to crisis services. Additionally, I work with corrections agencies on adopting and implementing policies that keep prisoners safe from sexual abuse. For many of you who are rape crisis counselors, a daunting aspect of working with incarcerated survivors is providing services to populations that are distinct from those who traditionally seek assistance from community-based centers and who are acutely underserved. For reasons we'll discuss in more depth today, deaf and hard of hearing survivors are one of those especially marginalized groups. In the community, the degree to which advocates provide services for deaf survivors may vary greatly. We know that many survivor advocacy programs already struggle to make services truly accessible to all survivors, including those with disabilities or mental illness, men of color, and other underserved communities. A key goal of this webinar series is to increase advocate comfort in working with traditionally underserved survivors, and by doing so, increase their comfort with applying their skills to helping all incarcerated survivors. So in addition to incarcerated deaf and hard of hearing survivors, we've been looking as part of this 6-part series at LGBTQ incarcerated survivors, those who have mental illness, those who are survivors of sexual abuse perpetrated by women and men of color. You've probably seen the announcement for the one remaining webinar. It's going to be next week, next Thursday, and the entire series will be archived in a closed caption format as well. And I just want to note the fact that I do have talking points. So I'm on camera for the ease of communication, but at the same time, I apologize. I'll be looking down a lot because I want to refer to my talking points. So what are the objectives of today's webinar? We want to strengthen understanding of the needs and experiences of incarcerated deaf and hard of hearing survivors, gain an awareness of the rights of these survivors and how to provide victim services that are truly accessible, and prepare to use the PREA standards to advocate for these survivors' safety and dignity. And the agenda for our conversation today, first we're going to look at prisoners who are deaf and hard of hearing and have an overview. Look at the PREA protections for deaf prisoners, that is the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And also look at working with deaf prisoners. And then we'll have a question and answer session during which you'll be able to ask questions of myself or the other speakers. We wanted to start with a poll before we jump into the content of the webinar. We wanted to pause and ask a couple of questions just to get a sense of where, for the advocates who are on the call today, where you are in terms of providing services to incarcerated deaf and hard of hearing survivors. So first, we wanted to ask, have you provided victim services for deaf survivors in the community at your programs? So if everyone can answer yes or no to that. And Edward, let me know if there's any other technical guidance that I should offer.
Yes, so just so you know, Scott is not viewable at the moment.
Oh, is that something I need to fix?
No.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let me wait for Scott to come back on.
I'm on right now.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great.
So just during the polls.
Oh, he won't be viewable during the polls.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I apologize for that.
So if you could introduce the polls before, and then we'll launch them, and we'll give people a little time to respond.
Okay. So the first poll is up now. So that's a question for the victim services advocates, rape crisis counselors in the community, asking, actually somehow we skipped ahead here. So the first question is, have you provided victim services for deaf survivors in the community? So for those who are service providers, if you can answer yes or no.
And I'll launch the results.
Okay. Okay, great. So it looks like 43% of you, of the advocates, have provided services for deaf survivors in the community, and 57% have not. So that indicates that, you know, definitely this is an area that more of you are trying to move into and wanting to do so in a competent way. Okay, an additional question, and so I assume the percentages of those who have done this will be even smaller. If you are a victim advocate or rape crisis counselor who has provided services for deaf or hard of hearing survivors in the detention context specifically, so incarcerated deaf or hard of hearing survivors, please indicate yes or no, whether you have done that or not. Okay, great. So it looks like 11% of you have, so not a very big number. and 89% have not. So definitely, this is an area of great concern. And I should say that even though these numbers are not very high, it's not, of course, it's a concern, and it's an area where we need to do more. The numbers themselves are not that surprising, in that it's estimated that only 5% of deaf rape survivors or deaf survivors of sexual assault report their assaults to police. And we're talking about in the community, of course, and 5% reach out for support from rape crisis centers. And so this is believed to be because of that communication barrier and culture clash that many deaf survivors face when they seek help from services that cater to hearing individuals. Okay, so tell us again for the advocates on the webinar, are your program staff culturally competent, culturally sensitive, and prepared to address the needs and concerns of incarcerated deaf and hard of hearing survivors? And that again is a yes or no question. Okay. Okay, so it looks like we've got 48%, so about half, who is thinking that they're where they want to be in terms of that preparation, and about 52% are half also who feel like there's some work that they need to do. And so let's see if we can help with that today. So one thing, before we again jump into the webinar, just tell us briefly for the advocates who are listening or who are participating in the chat box, tell us briefly what your concerns are about your readiness to provide culturally competent services for incarcerated deaf or hard of hearing survivors. Okay, so people are replying that they don't have the, I guess no one on staff who is a certified ASL interpreter, or maybe don't have access to a certified ASL interpreter. They're concerned about how the victim, so how a deaf survivor would contact the program and how to make the communication clear. Access to interpreters during a crisis, so I guess like on short notice when a survivor is in crisis. Confidentiality is a concern. Yeah, so those are the concerns. And I did see a note from someone expressing concern. I apologize. Is there an issue with accessing ASL, seeing a lot of talking over ignoring signers? And so I think now that we're closing the polls, you'll be able to see Scott again, who's the ASL interpreter. Is that, let me go to the next.
This is TL.
Yep, go ahead.
So what happened while you were speaking? I think you were sharing the statistics of the first poll. I might be wrong on which one. Jay was asking for clarification.
Oh.
And kind of missed the info. So he signed, he was asking for a little bit of clarification on those polls. So maybe if you could just repeat all of the polls statistics that you all received very quickly, that would be helpful.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I'm not sure if I have access to all of the statistics anymore, but
I'll share them, Cynthia. I'll share them one at a time.
Okay. And is Scott visible if I go back?
No, as long as I'm sharing the statistics, none of the cameras are viewable.
Okay. So let me see what the only statistic I see is, are you sharing them? I'm
One
sorry,
at a
Edward, are
time.
you sharing?
One at a time, Cynthia. And then you could explain them.
But I only see one statistic.
Right. I can only share them
Okay.
one at a time.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. So yeah, so one of them was to what degree advocates have provided services to deaf survivors in detention. So the percentage there was that 89% had not and 11% had.
And then in the community.
Okay. Okay. In the community, 43% of advocates had provided services to deaf survivors and about 57% had not. And then the last poll was, are your program staff culturally competent to address the needs and concerns of deaf and hard of hearing survivors? Yeah, and so 48% said they were, and 52% said they were not.
1 second, Cynthia. Sometimes when you're talking, I'm interpreting, and then you
Oh.
close and they can't see me. That was the reason I couldn't see Jeremy whenever he was signing. I don't remember exactly what he was signing, they said, but I couldn't see him. So
Okay.
just from that moving forward, just let me finish signing, and then you can go to the poll.
Okay. Okay, so were you able to sign about all the 3 different polls, or do we need to go back over one of them? And maybe that's a question for Jay. Were you able to, did you have any other question about the polls, or did that kind of make sense? Okay.
I'm good.
Good. Thank you. Okay, so let's move now into the substance of the presentation. So we're going to have an overview of deaf and hard of hearing prisoners and just look a little bit at that incarcerated population. Okay, so what is or who is in the community of deaf and hard of hearing prisoners, and who are they? It's estimated that between 50,000 and 150,000 US prisoners are deaf or hard of hearing. The Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is a government agency, estimates the percentage to be about 7% of all prisoners. In the community, about 2.1% of the population is deaf or hard of hearing. So that means, of course, that there's an overrepresentation of deaf and hard of hearing people in the criminal justice system. Unfortunately, most departments of corrections do not track numbers or locations of deaf prisoners, so we don't have more precise data than what I just gave. Persons are considered deaf if their hearing loss is such that they're unable to understand speech and must rely instead on their vision for communication. Many, but not all deaf people use ASL, or American Sign Language, which is not English interpreted with signs, but a distinct language that has grammar, syntax, and expression. It relies on reading people's faces and body language, as well as their hand movements. Some deaf individuals whose primary language is American Sign Language either use English as a second language or not at all. Sign language is thus required for effective communication, with deaf people. So this means that written materials are often inaccessible. And similarly, it's not appropriate to expect deaf people to lip read or to write notes back and forth as a means of communication. So I should note that this webinar encompasses the needs of a broader range of people beyond those who are deaf. So in addition, we'll be talking about the needs of people who are hard of hearing, as well as people who are deaf and blind or deaf-blind, people who are deaf and disabled or deaf-disabled, and those who are late deafened. That is, people who were hearing for most of their lives but had a substantial loss of hearing at some point in their life due to age or illness. And it includes those who are cochlear implant users, that is, those who use hearing devices. So where we're making distinctions between people who are deaf and those who are hard of hearing, we'll make that clear. But as you'll see today, many of the concerns facing people in these various categories are overlapping. And I should also make a note about language and culture. So one of the most important aspects of working with any community that has traditionally been marginalized is to respect their self-determination. That is the way that they identify and would like to be recognized. So in the deaf community, people use the capital D to differentiate between people who identify with deaf culture and identity, as opposed to the physical lack of hearing. So thus, some people who are deaf prefer deaf with a capital D, while others prefer lowercase d. And deaf people who use the capital D in the United States often do not identify as having a disability, but as members of a cultural group with language, customs, and shared norms. So while we will refer a couple of times to people who are deaf as people with disabilities, this is because there are certain legal protections that apply to the community of people with disabilities broadly, including people who are deaf. But we don't do that to take away from the right to self-determination for those who do not see themselves as having a disability. And we should also point out that not every deaf person that you might work with in detention will necessarily know American Sign Language or identify with the deaf community. So that's why we're using the capital D/deaf today with both the upper and lowercase d. And then HOH is an abbreviation that's widely used to indicate that someone is hard of hearing. So we wanted to share a quote from an incarcerated deaf person. His name is Jerry Cohen, and this is about his time in prison and the ways in which it can be extremely isolating for deaf people to be incarcerated. So he said, from the minute you go in, you're trapped in every way. You're trying to communicate, but you can't understand the rules or any of the information from the loudspeaker. It's a total communication breakdown. So what Jerry is referring to is that for many deaf prisoners, advocates and advocates for deaf prisoners refer to the isolation that's experienced by deaf prisoners as being a prison within a prison. So many deaf prisoners experience prolonged communication deprivation that leads to mental health conditions or exacerbates mental health conditions, and to them losing that ability to socialize or communicate with anyone in any language. And this holds true even for deaf prisoners who are housed in the general population in detention, not just those who are in some sort of solitary confinement setting. So as we can all imagine, living under these circumstances can cause tremendous distress. And the Bureau of Justice Statistics found that compared to those without a disability, prisoners with a disability, and so we're talking broadly about people with disabilities, not only referring to people who are deaf, were about 4 times more likely to report serious psychological distress in the past 30 days. And jail inmates were 2.5 times as likely. And so this study included prisoners who are deaf or hard of hearing. And I just wanted to acknowledge the heightened vulnerability that deaf and hard of hearing people are exposed to or face, the vulnerability to violence in the community. So deaf and hard of hearing people are 3 to 5 times more likely than hearing people to experience relationship violence, sexual harassment, sexual assault, psychological abuse, and physical abuse. So it's important to realize that many deaf people, and for advocates to realize that many of the deaf survivors that they may be working with are coming into the criminal justice system after experiencing tremendous discrimination and marginalization throughout their lives. So now we wanted to talk with Jay Woody, who is on the screen. He's a formerly incarcerated deaf man who lives outside of Atlanta, Georgia. He served time in a Georgia state prison, and he's an advocate for the rights of deaf prisoners. He has shared his story through interviews with the Marshall Project, Variety, and Rolling Stone. And also joining us, I should mention, is Esperanza Biller, who we should have acknowledged earlier. I apologize. She's a social worker, and she'll be providing any needed support for Jay as he's speaking with us. And I also wanted to mention that as I speak with Jay, that I'll be keeping track of time so that we don't run too long. And I'll do the same later on when we speak with Leland Lewis. So if I prompt Jay or Leland to move on to the next topic, please know that I don't mean any offense. It's just that we're being mindful of time. But I do recognize the importance of getting out all of the information and all of the things that everyone wants to share today. So Jay, welcome to the webinar. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Hello.
So first, I wanted to just talk generally about the conditions in the Georgia prison that you served time in. And I wonder if you can tell us what things were like in the Diagnostic Center in those early days. Were you able to communicate with other people?
Okay. So first of all, thank you for sharing that story. I'm happy to be able to be here today and share mine.
Great. And can you tell me, was it a bit overwhelming when you first got to the Diagnostic Center? How did you try to communicate with other prisoners and with staff?
So when I was first placed in there, I was already shackled, I had handcuffs on, they were in the front. I actually had no way to communicate with anyone. There was just zero communication. I wasn't able to express anything.
And was there an interpreter provided at all, an American Sign Language interpreter?
Well, I didn't have a way to even request the sign language interpreter because I was shackled. Mm-hmm. So I was in a black box. I wasn't able to communicate.
Were you how did the classification process work? Were you able to communicate at all with the classification staff about your concerns or your needs?
Whenever the guards and the nurses and all the different staff there would come to me, also during count times as well, they would call and wake us up in the morning to go to chow, or I would have different call outs, tests. They would have diagnostic for intake with the medical department. I would get up and nobody would have told me anything, so I missed some of these appointments. And they also scream at you to get me out of the bed. Well, I didn't know I was supposed to be up. Nobody explained those things to me because I didn't have an interpreter. So I would get up for count, and I really didn't even know what was going on. And I would go back to sleep. And then when it was time to eat again, nobody told me. They would all go chow, and I wouldn't be able to go because I didn't know about it. I was missing all types of appointments. They have these call-out sheets. Sometimes you have to get in line early in the morning to get to the medical, and they would do the diagnostic, and you talk to the doctor and the dentist and everybody that was involved in that process. And when I finally did go, the nurse came and told me that I was deaf, and they sent me back to the dorm. I didn't have a way to communicate with them. I never actually even had an opportunity to explain any of those concerns and needs that I had because there was a lack of communication.
Could you talk a little bit about the classes? When you found out about the classes that were offered at the prison, did you try to participate in any classes for prisoners?
So after the diagnostic process was over with, they had some classes. So as I was continuing to stay in prison, I found out that they offered different classes, and I was actually ready to take them. So I would go into the class, and the person who was leading it would come up to me, and then they would find out that I'm deaf, and they told me to go back to the dorm. I wasn't allowed to take the classes. That didn't happen just one time either. It happened probably 5 or 6 times.
Did you have a counselor that you could talk with or communicate with about any of these concerns that were coming up?
Well, I did go see a counselor. That person didn't know that I was deaf and that they needed an interpreter. There were requests from the warden to get an interpreter for me to meet my communication needs, but the warden would tell the counselor, no, we're not providing an interpreter. They would just kind of write back and forth with me and delay my appointments. They had no patience either because it takes 3 to 5 minutes just to get a thought process out on paper. So they would just dismiss me out of the office. They wouldn't even give me an opportunity to communicate that way.
Yeah, I'm sorry it was so tough. It sounds like the experiences that you had were a lot like what Jerry Cohen described in the previous slide, and the idea of a prison within a prison. Did you talk with other deaf guys in the prison? Did they have similar experiences to you?
Yeah, they actually had several deaf folks there when I was there, like sometimes up to 20. I did recognize that I was the only one really helping those guys. They would always come to me and ask me to help them write letters, interpret different things for them. I kind of acted as a deaf interpreter, which is completely different from hearing interpreter. So I helped those guys out a great deal while I was there, the entire time I was there.
That's great. Talila, did you want to add something? You're on that camera now.
I'm just here to make sure that Jay can see me as well.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned also, Jay, that prisoners who were deaf or hard of hearing were required to wear a button or a patch on their clothing to indicate that they were deaf or hard of hearing. Did that result in you being treated more fairly or less fairly?
Well, when I went through the intake diagnostic process center, they gave me a badge and it said deaf. I was okay with that. Just kind of let people know that I was deaf. When I was placed into the general population, I still had the tag on. After a while, though, I needed to get a new one because it deteriorated. I asked the person who was in charge of that, the person who was doing the engraving of the tags. They work in a different, it's an actual prisoner, but that's their job there. They do engravement. So I had to go through the approval process with the warden to get a new tag. And they told me it was silly. I didn't even know how to talk to the warden, though, to get the approval. I wasn't able to communicate. They told me to go talk to the warden, but I didn't have a way to talk to the warden. So I went to see my counselor to get a new tag, and they told me I had to talk with the warden as well. And I asked why. They said I had to go to the medical and get proof that I was deaf. So then I had to go and talk to another individual in medical, the nurse, and they sent me somewhere else. And while I was there, she talked to somebody, and it was just kind of like he said, she said, sending me here, sending me there. It was really silly. I just needed to get a tag that said I was deaf. It's very frustrating. Some of the hearing folks at the prison told me about the approval process, and they told me that they were taking advantage of us. They thought that I was playing games, but I wasn't. I'm deaf, and I just needed the wardens and the staff there thought I was playing games. But anyways, as time went on, I continued to have the same struggles.
And did you find that having the tag helped the staff to treat you in a more fair way?
Well, I mean, I already had a tag to show, and it was obvious that I was deaf. It obviously means that I can't hear and that I don't understand verbal communication, but that wasn't the case.
And so it sounds like what happened is that even though you had the tag on, the staff would still talk to you and expect you to follow commands, even though they might even be behind you, right? And expecting you to follow a command.
Yeah, that was a big problem, especially when they would walk behind us. The warden, the deputy warden, the deputy warden of therapy, and then the actual deputy warden of security, and the deputy warden of access administration. They would all walk in a line together with the lieutenant, the captain, the O2 officer, and security captain. And everybody's supposed to stand still and respect them and stay quiet. Once they were done, I recognized that they would come and try to talk to people, and I didn't have a way to communicate with them. They would come and say things to us, and I didn't understand what they were saying, and they just told me to move on and be quiet.
And what about communicating with people outside of the facility? Did you have access to like video relay services where you could have a conversation and communicate with someone outside the facility?
Yeah, we didn't have any video phones while I was incarcerated.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you if you are comfortable talking about it today. You did have an incident where you were sexually assaulted in your cell. Can you talk a little bit about what happened?
Sure. So that day, an individual tried to hurt me at night. We're inside the cell. We were on lockdown. I didn't have any way to communicate. I couldn't call on the button, and I couldn't speak through the button. Nobody could hear me.
And so were you pressing the button, but then once the speaker came on, you didn't have the ability to speak with them and tell them what was happening?
I didn't get any answer. I couldn't hear, so I didn't know when to speak or how to even work the call button. I didn't have any way to identify when I was supposed to be speaking, and vice versa.
So what happened? How long was it before you were able to get any help or any response from the staff?
The next morning, the lieutenant came around when they were doing count time. It was about 5. I had to wait until 5 in the morning from the open door, and then I ran out. And one of the guards asked me what happened, and I told him that it was at 5 count. Once they finished that, I ran out, and I couldn't get back in. But the lieutenant came around, and he opened up the cell for me, and I, on paper, explained what happened. So there were some people around, they were talking. I couldn't hear what they were saying. I guess they were discussing the situation. I didn't feel like it was fair because they were laughing. I didn't have access to what they were talking about. They acted like it was nothing. Later that afternoon, I filled out a request to see the counselor, and then 2 days later, I was able to access the counselor, and I explained via complaint what happened. And then they moved me to a different area. And the captain came. He's the one with all the power, and that's who actually moved me. They walked me over there. They read my grievance, and because I had asked to move. They were laughing, though. I guess they didn't approve of it. So I was stuck. Hang on one second. This is the interpreter clarification. So, clarification, I said that he moved. Was never able to move because the captain didn't approve the move. They kind of laughed it off and made him stay where he was at.
So I'm so sorry that that happened, both about the assault and about the facility's just awful response. So with the approval, with the request to move, oh, sorry.
In the cell, at 5 o'clock count, you're supposed to go to breakfast. So they have a PREA hotline. And it's on the call screen where you're supposed to be able to make phone calls.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't have a way to make a phone call. You're supposed to be able to report sexual abuse, but I wasn't able to because I didn't have access to it. So if something happens to hearing people, they're able to automatically run to the phone, report it, and then get help. But for me, if I pick up the phone, I'm not able to access it, and they don't have video phones or any way for me to make those phone calls to report sexual abuse.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in theory, a hearing person has several ways of making a report. They can tell any member of staff if there is a phone line to call, they can do that. They can make a written report, but there were no meaningful options open to you, which is awful and completely out of line with PREA and the ADA and other laws. So were you required to stay in the cell with the assailant?
Oh, 1 second. The screen is freezing.
Oh.
Can you guys see me clear? Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Were you required to stay in the cell with the perpetrator in that time after the assault because the request to be moved was not approved?
So about 7 months later, a man asked me if I would move cells. I said, sure, I'd love to move cells. They asked me who my roommate was, and my cellmate was, and they did it. So we moved. We had to go ask the security guard. They have a security booth where you have to kind of get approval for that. So me and the guy went over there. We asked the lieutenant. They were in security. And the hearing guy explained it. I didn't have an interpreter to ask, but the hearing guy asked, and they approved it quite quickly. He was able to communicate. I found that very interesting, and we just swapped, and that was it. It was quiet.
But in those 7 months before that, you were still living with the perpetrator.
Correct, and I was suffering through it. I tried to get out of there many a times for months. I wanted to move, and they turned me down. I asked so many people, they would laugh it off. Thought it was funny.
Well, I'm really sorry for those difficult experiences, but thank you for sharing that with us. I wanted to just ask briefly about some of the efforts that you were involved in to help other deaf prisoners while you were at the facility. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the needs were of the other prisoners?
Yes, I tried to do a lot of advocacy. For example, get interpreters for AA classes. They kept turning us down. Church services at night. They have different churches that volunteer to come in and provide services. There were no interpreters. A lot of the self-help classes like Celebrate Recovery, they didn't have interpreters. There were so many different programs that we could take as people who were incarcerated at night, and we just weren't able to because they didn't have interpreters. So that's what I advocated for.
So we're going to need to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to ask you, Jay, what advice would you give to rape crisis advocates who are working with deaf survivors, especially in the detention context? What would you want them to know?
Can you say that again?
Yeah, so for a rape crisis advocate who is working with a deaf survivor of sexual assault, particularly someone who's in prison, what would you want the advocate to know, that rape crisis counselor to know?
Nothing at all. 1 second. Let me interpret that differently. See, I was just kind of expanding, saying something about deaf culture. What would, if they could stop and eliminate rape in prison for people who don't have any idea about deaf culture, who have never worked with a deaf person, what would the best way to help them provide support to people who are incarcerated? How could they provide support? Yes, I understand very clearly. Well, my point is that you can't do anything until the Department of Correction takes accountability and provides training to their officers and gets interpreters and actually helps deaf people go through the counseling service in prison. So actually, it's the full accountability of the Department of Corrections. It's their job. It's not my job. It's actually theirs. Because for so many years, writing back and forth with them, I took the conversation first. They wouldn't let you write back and forth, and there was just so many problems you couldn't communicate with them.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you. So Jay, if you don't mind sticking around until the...
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Absolutely.
One of the things Jay just mentioned is really important, and I'm wondering if we can ask for expansion. Jay just mentioned writing back and forth was seen as personal communication. So I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit about that for people who might not understand what you mean.
Well, the policy in the Department of Correction is that you and any correctional officer as an inmate are not allowed to write back and forth. It's considered personal communication, like relationships, and it's forbidden. So a lot of the hearing people who are incarcerated think that if you're writing back and forth with the guard, you're snitching. And so when they see you do that, they think that I'm ratting on them. And they can try to kill me anytime they want to.
Yeah, I remember another thing that you said, Jay, that was really important, that for you to use signs, to use sign language, you were told that those are gang signs, or that's how gangs communicate, right?
Correct. I was told that it was against prison policy to sign because they thought that it was gang activity and they were communicating gesturally to communicate about gang activity.
Okay.
Thought we were making threats or that we were trying to hurt the officers, and so for a while it was forbidden to use sign language. I'm like, I'm not a gang member. I'm deaf, and I require sign language to communicate for access. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, Jay, is there anything else you wanted to share right now? What I'd like to do is move on and come back to you during the Q&A session. But if there's anything else you wanted to put out right now, you can definitely do that.
Sure. I would like people out there to know that when a deaf person goes to prison or jail, not appropriate to put them in isolation because it just makes the situation worse. As opposed to hearing people, they can communicate. But for many years, deaf people are isolated. The Department of Corrections really takes advantage of federal funding, and that's just the way it's been for so long. They pass bills by, hang on 1 second, clarification. The ADA was passed by George Bush in the 1990s. And since then, until present, they still get federal funding Yet, where's that funding going? They're definitely not paying for interpreting services or access to communication. So what are they doing with it? I would like to prevent DOC from continuing to make deaf and hard of hearing folks who are incarcerated suffer. Deaf folks have a right to ask, to meet with folks, and also to stop the abuse and suffering. And they need to set up some ways to prevent hearing incarcerated people from taking advantage of deaf prisoners. They think it's easy to do. They also need to do more investigating in the cases before they go and incarcerate deaf folks. They had a coder that was in prison while I was there as a child of a deaf adult who was a signer, but he was hearing. He could call his mom and dad, but he couldn't call his mother and father. But and I couldn't call anybody on the outside, which is also unfortunate that children of deaf adults don't have a way to communicate with their deaf parents on the outside.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. So let's move forward a little bit, and then during the Q&A session, hopefully there'll be time for you to add a bit more. Thank you. Great. So I'm not going to spend much time on this because I want to get to our other guest, who is Leland Lewis. But I just want to mention very briefly, and what you can do is go back into the slides after the webinar is over and take a further look at this. But just wanting to mention that the PREA standards, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which we have been talking about today, was signed also by George W. Bush in 2003. This is a federal civil law, and it was established to address this problem of sexual abuse in detention. So the goal of it was essentially to keep people safe, protect survivors of sexual abuse from perpetrators of sexual abuse, provide multiple ways to report, which is something we've already heard that for deaf and hard of hearing prisoners is not happening in many cases, offering medical and mental health care for survivors, increasing accountability for sexual abuse in detention so that we can no longer say that's just part of life behind bars, and also providing survivors access to victim services. So just a little bit of data, the prevalence of sexual abuse in prisons and jails. There is a estimate by the lead researcher or the person who was the lead researcher at the Bureau of Justice Statistics that roughly 200,000 people are sexually abused in U.S. prisons and jails each year. We should note that this figure represents only the number of people, not the number of incidents. Apologize. Many of the 200,000 people who are victimized are abused more than once. And to put this into perspective, that 200,000 number is approximately the population of Richmond, Virginia, which is a major U.S. city, of course. And studies show that the rates of abuse, that it's nearly equal rates of sexual abuse by staff as other inmates. So this is not a type of abuse that's limited to other prisoners. I also wanted to mention that intersectionality matters, right? So when you think about who's most vulnerable to sexual abuse in detention, the list includes the groups that the data tell us are most often targeted, such as people who are LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, people who have mental illness, or people who are survivors of prior sexual abuse, those who have disabilities or who are relatively young in comparison to the facility population, or relatively small in stature are also at elevated risk. But we know that identity is layered, right? And many survivors of sexual abuse belong to more than one of these at-risk groups. And that can make them even more vulnerable to sexual abuse and even less likely to get the help they need and more likely to experience retaliation when they make a report. Okay, so there are some key PREA standards. These are standards under the Prison Rape Elimination Act that facilities are required to follow. I'm highlighting these. I'm not going to spend much time on them now, but they are important, particularly for victim advocates to be aware of, because these are standards that may be especially helpful to you when you are engaged in any systems advocacy on behalf of incarcerated clients who are deaf or hard of hearing. So just taking a moment to look at these standards, there is a standard on prevention which requires that facilities ensure that prisoners with disabilities, including prisoners who are deaf, are able to benefit from policies, programs, and protocols that the facility puts into place as part of its Prison Rape Elimination Act implementation. So I think that in the interview or the discussion with Jay, we heard many, many examples of ways in which the facility that he was at and where other deaf prisoners and hard of hearing prisoners were incarcerated were not able to benefit from, all of the steps that that facility had taken. And I'm sure that even if the facility hadn't done, everything that it should do to address sexual abuse, probably there were many, many things that were in place. And so you see all of the examples of ways in which someone who is deaf, simply being able to report, knowing information about their rights, being able to get help, being able to get moved to safer housing, etc. All of prevention of retaliation, those things were not addressed. There are also legal protections for deaf prisoners or that apply to deaf prisoners under the Americans with Disabilities Act and under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. I'm not going to go into those in detail, but those are just other legal protections to be aware of. Okay, so we don't have a whole lot of time left before the Q&A, so I want to transition into a little discussion on working with deaf prisoners and introduce to Leland Lewis, who is the co-founder and volunteer director of an organization called HEARD, helping to educate and advance the rights of deaf communities. Welcome, Talila, or TL.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Okay. So can you talk a little bit about just your own background, your own journey to this work and becoming so involved in working for the rights of deaf prisoners?
This is TL. I would love to do that, but I know that we're very limited in time, so I really want to focus our attention on the issues if that's possible. And so I'm going to skip that because people can go. I think that we have to start off by saying that prisons in general are violent places, and that the end goal of the work of HEARD, Esperanza is a social worker, deaf social worker with our organization. Jay, I've known Jay for about 7 years through prison correspondence, only handwritten letters. That is not effective communication for us. Scott Huffman is also one of our HEARD folks, formerly incarcerated himself. So what our end goal is actually abolishing prisons, helping people understand that criminalization of disability, criminalization of race, criminalization of deafness and trans identities, it's not okay. And we as a society are finished with that. What we see historically and how that informs our present work is that deaf, disabled, Black, Indigenous, trans folks, and all the other marginalized folks have historically been the first people to be institutionalized, to be in prison, and to be deemed okay to murder. And so I think what we're talking about right now, it's really important to connect that historical context as well. That's kind of where I want to start. And I want to thank you, Jeremy, because I know that this is incredibly difficult for you to share. And I have to name that Jay's story is one of thousands, if not millions. And I think your next question is, why is it that I'm able to talk about this? And there are three answers to that. Like, why have I become the person who's pushing this narrative? Why are so few people discussing this? The first answer is that's not true. It's deaf people on the inside of prisons who are doing all of the work, taking all of the risks. I just happen to be the person to find these folks and care enough to say we need to share the narrative. The second is about hearing privilege. The fact that I can say the same thing that Jay just said and be heard is really indicative of autism. The fact that people can hear me and not Jay, like and not in a literal sense, but listen to me, as opposed to Jay and the thousands of other deaf people, some of whom are dead now as a result of hearing people not listening, not paying attention, not acknowledging hearing privilege, linguicism, which is discrimination based on language use, and autism. That's the second key problem. The third is really racism and classism within deaf and disability communities. Had deaf and disability rights communities been addressing issues of incarceration, addressing issues of marginalization of Black and low income and disabled deaf people, we wouldn't be where we are today. And the same is true on the opposite side. If people fighting against racism, fighting against classism, working to end prisons, but aren't focusing on deafness when deaf people and disabled people are the largest minority in jails and prisons across the nation, when deaf and disabled people are the most frequently killed by law enforcement annually. Over half of the people killed by cops annually are actually deaf and disabled. So erasure of that narrative. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I feel like we need to tie this to the broader narrative of mass incarceration, because what we're looking at when we look at the carceral state at present and all of the other ties to it, so the school to prison pipeline, what we're looking at is not just racism and classism and transphobia, but also structural ableism that's built not just within the carceral system and the legal system, but also within education systems and society writ large. So now I'll let you ask your next question.
Okay. So what I'd love to hear is a little bit about some of the common obstacles, discrimination and abuses that you see deaf and hard of hearing people facing in prison. I know that with Jay, we certainly heard about quite a number of those things, but I'd love to hear kind of from the larger sense that you might have around patterns of this type of abuse and discrimination.
So again, from start to finish, the legal system is set up to incarcerate and unfortunately do damage to deaf and disabled people in the same way that it's set up to incarcerate and do damage to other communities that have been made vulnerable. So Black folks, trans folks. So at the time of arrest, often deaf people, disabled people are being arrested for simply being deaf and disabled. So that's where it begins. I just watched an interview with another deaf person from the state of Georgia with police officers who were finger spelling at him about a murder, right? And that person received a life sentence. As a young Black person in Georgia prisons right now, culturally deaf, no accommodations. So now we've got, arrest, defense attorney didn't provide interpreters for that same person. And this is across the board. I'm using this person as an example because this is the person that's on my heart right now. No interpreter with law enforcement, no interpreter with defense counsel. By the time this person arrived at trial, because this person refused to accept a guilty plea because they claim innocence, they had lost most of their mind because of communication deprivation in the jail in which they sat for 2 years and experienced other forms of abuse while they were waiting for trial, right? The fact that then you arrive at trial, can't process what's going on. A lot of the interpreters are not effective at communicating with incarcerated folks, especially those of whom who now have disabilities because of the conditions of confinement. Fast forward to prison for this person and others, attempts at suicide, extreme bullying by staff and prisoners alike, no communication access with loved ones. If you have children who are signing children, they often lose their ability to communicate because you've got to be constantly exposed to signs, so you're losing your relationship with your family members. No access to the classes and just general socialization. So people who have freedom privilege, people who are outside of prison spaces don't understand the importance of just general camaraderie and communication. Prisons have a very unique culture. And if you don't understand the culture within the prison, you will be taken advantage of. And even if you do understand the culture within the prison, you will be taken advantage of. All of that is not conveyed to deaf people, not just the rules as in the rules in the rule book, but the general rules of the prison that are not named. How to stand in a shower, how to behave when you're interacting with guards. So down in Georgia where Jay is, you're not supposed to look at wardens in particular prisons. Well, how would a deaf person be able to communicate who's sighted if they're not looking at the person walking by who's the authoritarian, right? So there are extreme cultural clashes between so-called prison cultures, which there are many, and deaf cultures, again, of which there are many. And deaf people are punished. Deaf, disabled folks are punished for not knowing, for not being able to do things that they're not informed about. That actually leads to longer sentences. So the irony of the language deprivation that led you to prison, the abuse prior to incarceration, hearing people not providing access, which leads to trauma outside of prison, which makes you upset, maybe you have an impulse control disorder now because of years and years of deprivation of communication and language. Boom, you land in prison. And now that same thing that landed you there is the thing that prevents you from getting out, that causes you to have a longer stay. And then when you finally do get out, you're traumatized and no one can provide services for you because most deaf, signing deaf counselors aren't aware enough of deaf prison situations, prison generally, to be able to adequately provide that support. And hearing counselors, you know, mental health support services don't know about deaf culture and aren't, you know, moving forward, learning, making sure they're providing access. So really, formerly incarcerated deaf people literally end up in a cycle that we've created. Then back to prison much faster, right? Because now you can't get a job. Not only are you deaf and people are discriminating against you because you're deaf or disabled, but you now have a felony record, which we need to be challenging all of these things as well. So quite literally, we've created a system where people are suffering and dying and then being rung right back through the system. There's no incentive to provide communication access in our prisons. My organization fought for, I guess we're on year 10 of fighting for video phones in prisons across the nation. Video phones are free. And that's precisely the reason why the prison system doesn't want to put them in. So when we talk about the money incentive behind the big prison telephone companies, right? So they say, oh, you have an exclusive contract with us. They make millions and billions of dollars annually, depending on the company, and won't provide video phones, which are free, right? Because that's going to cut into their bottom line. Not that deaf, blind, deaf, disabled, and hard of hearing folks are even able to use the phones that they have set up because they are inaccessible phones, right? So these are the kinds of battles that we've been fighting. That's just one example of thousands. And we're a volunteer dependent organization. So what we need is people who have resources, and this is why I appreciate that this webinar is happening, to say, hey, we're willing to learn, what can we do better? And of course, like Jeremy said, emphasizing government accountability. But then at the end of the day, the goal should be ending all violence in our communities, decriminalizing all the things that are criminalized, and putting an end to prisons for once and for all. So that's kind of our position around that as well. So I hope that helps you get a broader lay of the land.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So what we're going to do now, while we have 10 minutes left, is go to the Q&A. Let's get some of your questions. The remaining slides that we didn't go over, you can see them because they will be posted on our website, but we don't have time to sort of go over each of them now. Edward, are we receiving any questions? Let's see. Okay. I have seen prison facilities have units for deaf individuals where they are housed together. They say that this helps them provide the resources to support their needs. Can Jay or Talila speak to whether this would be helpful or more isolating from opportunities, if that makes sense?
It's up to you.
This is
Yeah.
based on interactions with hundreds of deaf people across the nation, many of whom have been forced into what we call clustering. Again, the answer is it depends on the individual. But what I've seen, since we're talking about sexual abuse in carceral spaces, and just violence generally, many deaf people say, why would I want to go to that prison that's so far away from my family when the prison can simply provide access where I am? The second thing is, hearing people often are not forced to be together simply because they share an identity. However, if the violence, the intra-community violence that has happened, whether that be physical abuse, sexual abuse, if there might be rival gang members, and now you're forcing deaf people to be together, sometimes with the person who might have assaulted them. These are true stories. I'm not just being hypothetical. Now we have a situation where you force the person to be far from family, still having no access. So let's begin with, folks are clustering people, but often are still not providing meaningful access to programs, services, and activities, which is required by federal disability rights laws. So this idea of, oh, let's cluster folks, while it seems nice, it's really a checkbox. Oh, see, we clustered all the deaf together, and there's other things that are going on in that mix. Sometimes we're finding that deaf people are housed at like maximum security prisons when they are literally classed at medium or minimum low security status, simply so they can be with other deaf people. So there's so many different layers to it. It's not as simple as that, but I wonder if Jay has any specific thoughts around it.
Well, I definitely want to see the system change. I definitely would like to see a system where deaf people are able to access each other, and you can have communication access for medical, church, counseling, program classes, and a variety of different reentry services. And to get certificates that you need in order to get an early release for pre-release. That way, you don't have to stay as long. You get a good time to go home. I would like them to set up VR services prior to release, so that when you get out, you can get your driver's license, your birth certificate, and all the things that you need whenever you hit the streets again. Those types of things are what should be set up on the inside, and you be prepared to go home. Also, to be able to communicate with family and friends prior to, there's just a lot of different things that need to be set up. But if you don't know where to go your first day out, there's no communication access. Nobody tells you where to go, and it's just a big wake-up call. Sometimes you wake up in the morning and they tell you to pack your stuff and they put you on a bus and then you leave. I was headed to Atlanta. I didn't have anybody pick me up, So I needed to go to Athens. So there was a place in Athens that I was going to have to stay the night. And there was nobody there. I had never been there before, but I was wondering why the prison just left me there. They told me that there wasn't any availability where I was supposed to go, but they transferred me on a bus and forced me to go to another place in Athens. I was supposed to go to Atlanta. I didn't have any way to call anybody because I didn't have any communication access. I didn't have a video phone, I didn't have a cell phone. So I had to ask somebody if they would make a phone call to one of my families in Washington. And it was very confusing, but the person helped me. I'm freezing up. So I had to stay in a hotel for 3 months. I had to go to the Social Security office. I had to get people to help me out. I had to go get a birth certificate. I didn't have any of that. I needed to go get a driver's license. I had to go to the DMV. None of them had an interpreter. They said that I had to get proof of my Social Security card and birth certificate and a picture ID. So then I had to go to the Social Security office without an interpreter and try to communicate those things and tell them that I needed my Social Security card and ID. I had to provide identification of who I was, but I didn't have any of those things. I didn't have a picture ID. So it was one person telling me to go here and another person telling me to go there, and I was ill prepared. And it was just overwhelming and frustrating. It took me a month to be able to get all that wrapped up. Even then, I had to do parole 3 times a week, and I had to go during the day and at night sometimes. And I mean, it was just very stressful. I didn't have a way to get around, and I had no interpreters. So finally, I got my birth certificate, and I was able to go to the DMV and get my license, and that was good. I went to the Social Security office. They gave me the runaround, and that was very troubling. I had cancer at that time, and I was going through a hard time. I lost a lot of weight, wasn't able to eat, and they had a hurricane that came. Irma, okay, Hurricane Irma. And everything was jumbled around. It was like almost 2 weeks, and they said that I had to have a place to live within 30 days. And it was getting towards the end of that 30 days. And I needed more time to get out the county and find a place to live. And I was just getting the runaround. It was terrible. It was an awful experience. It's just a long story, but I want to see the system change completely.
Mm-hmm. And oh, sorry, go ahead.
This is TL. I just want to emphasize that Jay, like many other deaf incarcerated folks who have some access to English, end up serving as an advocate within the prison, and they are punished mightily for that. Part of the punishment for that is often sexual and physical abuse by staff, by guard, by literally everyone in the prison. And so Jay was thrown out. We actually believe that he was held past his time, thrown out quickly because he is an advocate. And so there's so much more to the story. Obviously, I feel like we're both having to hyper-synthesize a lot, and I think we're both really overwhelmed trying to get a lot of information out. But what he's explaining is happening to deaf incarcerated people all around the nation, especially those of whom speak up for their rights. And so that's why it's our responsibility to support their efforts, make sure people know that we're watching, that we care, that we're going to hold the government to account, that we're not going to let people just take advantage of our community. And HERD has been providing Jay support since before he left the prison, and while he was in jail as well. But again, we're a volunteer dependent organization, and we shouldn't have to be doing that. Not that we're complaining about it, we love him and we want to do that. But he should have never been in this situation in the first place. And he shouldn't be what's going on right. He had stage 4 cancer in prison. no interpreters. You know, you can't explain. I know we're out of time at this point. It's just
and Deaf Services has an office in Georgia, but they don't support any deaf and hard of hearing prisoners. They should have some type of emergency fund or service set up for people who are coming out of prison. However, there is nothing, and that is quite disturbing. They need to work on that.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you all. We are out of time. There will be an evaluation that will, I believe, pop up. You will automatically be taken to an evaluation when you close out of the webinar. For those who are able and interested, could you please complete the evaluation? But more than anything, I just want to say thank you to all of you, to Jay, to Scott, to TL, to Esperanza, for being part of the webinar. I mean, and also to my colleague Edward. This was truly a team effort, and I know we didn't do the issue full justice, but I really hope that this has been helpful. And more than anything, thank you, Jay, for sharing, for your bravery and courage, for being here today and for sharing with us. It means a tremendous amount. There is going to be a webinar next Thursday on working with survivors, incarcerated survivors who have disabilities. So more broadly, looking at folks who are incarcerated with disabilities, from 2 to 3:30 Eastern. So you can sign up for that on our website, the Just Detention International website. Let me just take you to the page where you can at least just see our website, www.justdetention.org. And otherwise, we're going to close out, and thank you all.
Thank you.